the year 1000. A clear spring sun shines over Gniezno, the capital of the young Polish duchy, but the air is still sharp. Winter has retreated reluctantly, leaving behind sodden, frozen earth. A tense excitement hangs over the city, and the air is thick with the mingled scents of incense and wax. Here, in the heart of the Poland's domain, an event is brewing that is destined to change the course of history. All is still, in anticipation of a great moment, and the focus of this anticipation is the main cathedral. Inside the recently consecrated church, on a crudely built but imposing oak throne, stands a silver casket adorned with intricate metalwork. Resting on a purple silk pillow inside is a severed head. Just 3 years ago, it belonged to a Prague bishop named Wojciech. Now, it has become the ultimate relic, the mortal remains of the holy martyr Adalbert. It is this sacred object that commands everyone's attention. The body of the saint, killed by pagan Prussians, was purchased for its weight in gold, turning the relic into the greatest of treasures. And now, kneeling before it, is a 23-year-old man, Otto III, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The heir of Charlemagne and the Roman Caesars, the most powerful ruler in the Christian world, has come here as a pilgrim to honor the memory of the martyr. This emperor was no conqueror, but a mystic and a dreamer. Otto was obsessed with the idea of renovatio imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire. But he envisioned his empire not as an alliance of force, but as a universal Christian state, where Romans, Gauls, Germans, and Slavs would be equals. In this grand plan, a very special role was reserved for the man standing beside him. Tall and broad-shouldered, the 33-year-old Duke Bolesław gazes at the silver casket. There is sorrow in his eyes. The murdered bishop was his friend. But beneath the sorrow lies the shrewd and cold calculation of a statesman. He understands perfectly that the head in the casket is not just a holy relic, but something far greater. For him, a pragmatist, this relic is the key to a magnificent future. For Bolesław, this severed head has become a ticket to the major leagues of European politics. He intends to use it as a foundation upon which to build something immeasurably greater than his Slavic duchy, a true kingdom. At this moment, with tears of reverence in his eyes, Emperor Otto rises from his knees to perform a series of symbolic acts that will astound all who are present. The emperor removes his golden diadem and places it on Bolesław's head. Then he drapes his own purple cloak over the duke's shoulders. Finally, he presents him with a replica of the Holy Lance, the very spear a Roman legionary used to pierce the crucified Christ, a gift more valuable than any treasure, for within it is a nail from the true cross. This gesture was not merely a gift, it was an act of investiture. In that era, everyone understood the language of these symbols. The diadem was a recognition of royal dignity. The lance granted the right to raise an army in the name of the empire and to wage holy war. The emperor proclaimed Bolesław a brother and partner of the empire, and a friend and ally of the Roman people. Bolesław had been recognized as an equal. It seemed, on that March day, that a completely new Europe was being born. However, no one standing in the cathedral could have imagined how short-lived this alliance would be. No one suspected that the dreamer emperor would be dead in just 2 years, and his visions of a universal empire, founded on friendship and a shared future, would turn to dust. Bolesław's friendship with the empire was also doomed. No one could have imagined that Bolesław, honored by the emperor and named a friend of the Roman people, would soon launch a brutal war against the empire that would last for 18 years and bleed an entire generation dry. No one thought that he would lead his army east and strike his sword against the Golden Gate of Kyiv, challenging the nascent world of the Rus. But on that day, Bolesław was at his zenith. On that March day, he stood at the peak of his first triumph. He was not yet a king, nor did he bear the title the Brave, but he already had all the pieces arranged for a grand and bloody game of chess. The stake in this game, which he would play for his entire life, was the crown of Poland and the fate of all of Central Europe. To understand his path, we must return to his origins. To understand Bolesław's deeds, one must look to the 10th century, a world where history was deeply intertwined with myth, and the names of dukes sounded like pagan incantations. Bolesław did not build on empty ground. He was the heir of his father, Mieszko, who had caused a tectonic shift in his people's history, forcibly tearing them from the darkness of paganism and pulling them into the orbit of Christian Europe. The state of Poland did not appear at the snap of a finger. It was forged in the fire of brutal intertribal wars. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the lands between the Oder and Vistula rivers were inhabited by numerous West Slavic tribes: the Polans, Vistulans, Masovians, and Pomeranians. They lived in fortified settlements, worshipped Svarog, Perun, and Veles, making sacrifices to them in sacred groves, and had no single ruler. Among these tribes, the Polans, who lived in the region of modern-day Poznan, proved to be the strongest and most warlike. Their legendary rulers, Piast, Zemowit, Leszek, and Zimomysł, subjugated their neighbors through force and cunning, creating the core of the future state. Around the year 960, this fragile tribal domain was inherited by Zimomysł's son, Mieszko, who immediately faced a threat far more terrifying than any Slavic tribe. This threat came from the West. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, reborn under Otto the Great, saw its mission not only in uniting German lands, but also in the Drang nach Osten, the push to the east. This expansion had two dimensions: a military one aimed at conquering land, and a religious one with the goal of converting pagans. For the Slavs, this posed a dual threat. Greedy and cruel German margraves, acting with both sword and cross, seized Slavic lands beyond the Elbe River, establishing their border marches there. Simultaneously, missionaries converted pagans to the Christian faith. For the neighboring Polabian and Lutyti tribes, this ended in true catastrophe. They were either completely exterminated or forcibly baptized and Germanized. Their fate became a lesson for Mieszko. Watching the destruction of his western neighbors, Mieszko, a shrewd enough ruler, understood that his pagan duchy was doomed. Sooner or later, it would become the next victim of German expansion, and resisting alone was futile. The only way to survive and preserve his independence was to enter the Christian world not as a conquered slave, but as an equal partner. To accept baptism from the hands of German bishops would mean inevitable political submission to the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, another source of faith had to be found, and such a source was found to the south, the Czech Duchy, ruled by the Przemyslid dynasty. This path allowed him to avoid German hegemony and maintain his autonomy. The Czechs were already Christians, but had preserved their Slavic identity and independence, though they were vassals of the empire. In 965, Mieszko formed a strategic alliance with the Czech Duke Bolesław I, known as the Cruel, sealing it by marrying his daughter, the Christian princess Dobrawa. Then, in 966, the year that became the starting point of Polish history, Mieszko and his warband accepted baptism in the Latin Rite. The consequences of this step were colossal. First, Baptism stripped the Germans of their main ideological pretext for invasion. The Polans were no longer pagans to be saved with fire and sword, but brothers in Christ. Any war against Mieszko would now be considered not a holy mission, but an ordinary act of conquest, which completely eliminated the primary threat. Second, this act opened Poland's access to Western European civilization. Along with priests and monks came architects who brought with them the Latin script, the art of stone construction, and new methods of administration and legal norms. In Gniezno, Poznań, and on the island of Ostrów Lednicki, the construction of the first churches began, marking the start of the country's modernization. Finally, third, Mieszko achieved a huge diplomatic victory. The first Polish bishopric was established in Poznań, reporting directly to the Pope in Rome, not to a German archbishop. Christianity also became a powerful tool for internal consolidation. A single faith cemented disparate tribes into a single people, and the Duke's authority, now building churches on the sites of pagan shrines, received sacred legitimacy from God himself. However, accepting Christianity did not guarantee peace. German margraves still saw Poland as a dangerous competitor. In 972, one of the most powerful border lords, Margrave Hodo, invaded Mieszko's domains. In the decisive battle near the town of Sidynia on the Oder River, the Germans were initially pushing the Poles back, but a sudden ambush led by Mieszko's brother, Cibor, resulted in their complete rout. Mieszko understood that he could not fight the powerful empire forever. Proving himself a true realist, after the victory at Sidynia, he sought closer ties with Emperor Otto I and his successors. He acknowledged himself as the emperor's vassal for the lands west of the Warta River, a wise move that secured peace on his western borders and allowed him to focus on unifying the remaining Polish lands. By the end of his reign, Mieszko had significantly expanded his domain, annexing Silesia and likely Lesser Poland with Kraków, which he took from the Czechs. And in this turbulent era, in the year 967, a son was born to him and the Czech princess Dobrawa. The infant was named Bolesław, in honor of his maternal grandfather, the Czech Duke Bolesłav the Cruel. This boy was destined to grow up watching his father's titanic work. The boy grew up seeing his father raise crosses where pagan idols once stood. He absorbed stories of battles with the Germans and complex diplomatic games. He saw how his father, like a pagan wolf turned Christian prince, stitched a unified state from tribal patches through force and cunning. He understood that his people's future depended on taking their rightful place in the new Christian Europe. Mieszko created the foundation. Bolesław was to erect the building upon it. But before he could complete his father's work, he had to enter a brutal struggle for his inheritance. In his final years, the great duke failed to ensure a peaceful transfer of power, and his last actions planted a mine under the state. And the first person who had to defuse it was his eldest son. The problem began with the death of Bolesław's mother. Mieszko's first wife, Dobrawa, died in 987, severing the dynastic alliance with Bohemia. Soon after, the duke remarried. His chosen bride was Oda, the daughter of the German aristocrat, Dietrich of Haldensleben. This marriage, which required papal dispensation due to Oda's past as a nun, was a purely political act aimed at strengthening ties with the Saxon nobility. This second marriage had fateful consequences. Oda bore Mieszko 3 more sons, Mieszko, Świętopełk, and Lambert. Thus, the aging Polish duke had 2 sets of heirs. On one side was his eldest son, Bolesław, from the Czech princess. On the other, 3 younger sons from the German aristocrat, who were connected through their mother to the powerful imperial nobility. Conflict was inevitable. As Mieszko aged, the influence of Oda and her party at court grew. Fearing her powerful and ambitious stepson, she sought to secure the future of her own children. Bolesław, who had already participated in his father's campaigns, saw his stepmother and half-brothers as a direct threat to his birthright. The court in Gniezno split into two warring factions, foreshadowing imminent civil strife. Shortly before his death, around the year 991, Mieszko took a mysterious step by creating a document known as the Dagome Iudex. In this act, preserved in the Vatican archives, the Duke, referred to as Judge Dagome, along with his wife Oda and their sons, placed his State of Gniezno under the special protection of the Pope. This document had a dual, highly ambiguous meaning. On one hand, it was a brilliant diplomatic move, continuing Mieszko's policy of securing independence. By placing his state under the patronage of the Pope himself, he elevated it above the jurisdiction of both the German archbishops and the emperor. Now, anyone who encroached on Polish lands would formally be encroaching on the property of St. Peter. It was a foreign policy victory. However, the document's internal political aspect was ominous for Bolesław. The list of donors placing the state under Rome's protection mentioned Mieszko, Oda, and their sons. Bolesław's name, the principal heir, is absent from the text. Historians interpret this in various ways. Some believe the old duke, succumbing to Oda's pressure, decided to divide the realm or even disinherit his eldest son of the main portion of the inheritance. On May 25, 992, Mieszko I died. The succession crisis he had set in motion immediately exploded, plunging the country into a period the German chronicler Thietmar of Merseburg called a time of strife. A brutal struggle for power began. Relying on a faction of the nobility and their powerful German relatives, Oda and her sons attempted to seize power, seeking to implement the late duke's will to divide the state. But they clearly underestimated the 25-year-old Bolesław, an experienced warrior backed by the majority of his father's warband, the foundation of ducal power. He had no intention of sharing his father's legacy with anyone. The details of the struggle have not survived, but its outcome is known. The conflict was brief, perhaps lasting only a few months, and ended in Bolesław's complete victory. Unwilling to escalate tensions with the German nobility by killing his half-brothers, he simply exiled his stepmother, Oda, and her sons from the country. They found refuge in Germany with their supporters. Then, Bolesław committed another cruel but symbolic act. He ordered the blinding of two influential nobles, Odalin and Przybyłoj, who were Oda's chief advisors and the organizers of the plot. In that era, blinding was not just a punishment, but a method of political liquidation. A blind man could not claim power or lead an army. With this act, Bolesław sent a clear signal that any attempt to challenge his authority would be punished mercilessly. By the end of 992, having reversed the division of the country and consolidated all lands under his rule, Bolesław became the sole sovereign. This first victory, won against his own family, was his baptism by fire. He proved that he had inherited not only his father's lands, but also his iron will, unyielding political grip, and a readiness to stop at nothing. With security established within the country, Bolesław could finally turn to foreign policy. He had shown himself to be a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. And soon, fate would bring him together with a wandering bishop from Prague named Wojciech, a meeting destined to change both his life and the future of all of Poland. While Bolesław was exiling his stepmother and blinding his enemies to establish order in his state, a drama was unfolding in neighboring Bohemia. At first glance, it had no connection to Poland, but its tragic finale would place in Bolesław's hands the most powerful tool of his future policy, the relics of a holy martyr, which would become his key to a crown. At the center of the Bohemian drama stood Wojciech, from the powerful ducal clan of the Slavniks. Their domains in eastern Bohemia, with their center in the town of Libite, were an almost independent state. The Slavniks were the second most influential clan in the country after the ruling Przemyslid dynasty, with whom they were engaged in a fierce rivalry for supreme power. As one of the younger sons, Wojciech was destined for a career in the church. He received an excellent education at the famous cathedral school in Magdeburg, where he changed his Slavic name to one more familiar to the Germans, Adalbert, in honor of his mentor. This is the name he would carry for the rest of his days, and with it, he would enter the history of the Christian Church. Upon returning to his homeland, Adalbert, thanks to his family's influence, was elected Bishop of Prague in 982. But unlike many aristocratic churchmen, he was a deeply devout and uncompromising reformer. He was horrified by the morals of his diocese, where Christianity was merely a superficial veneer, while the nobility and common folk continued to practice pagan rites. Polygamy, the slave trade, and blood feuds flourished. With fanatical energy, Adalbert set about eradicating these vices, demanding celibacy from the clergy and an end to the trade in Christian slaves from the dukes. His activities, aimed against deep-rooted customs and sources of income, provoked fierce resistance from both the nobility and the common people. The ruling duke, Bolesław II, known as the Pious, supported the bishop's reforms only in words, not daring to oppose the aristocracy. Feeling powerless, Adalbert took an unprecedented step in 988. He abandoned his diocese and went to Rome, where he became a monk in a Benedictine monastery on the Aventine Hill. He had surrendered and withdrawn from the world, but the world would not leave him in peace. A few years later, at the insistence of the Pope and the Czech Duke, he was forced to return to Prague. The conflict with his flock immediately flared up with renewed intensity and reached its peak when Adalbert granted sanctuary in a church to a woman accused of adultery. An enraged mob, incited by her husband, stormed the sanctuary and murdered the unfortunate woman right at the altar. Shocked by this sacrilege and his own impotence, Adalbert laid a curse upon his flock and left Prague for a second time. Shortly thereafter, in 995, the Czech Duke Bolesław II, taking advantage of the absence of Adalbert's brothers, treacherously attacked the Slavnik capital of Libice. The town was taken by storm, and all members of the powerful clan, including women and children, were brutally exterminated. Adalbert became an exile, deprived of both his bishop's see and his family. Obsessed with the idea of missionary work among pagan peoples, he sought a new outlet for his indomitable energy. First, he went to Hungary, where, according to some sources, he baptized the future King Stephen I. He then arrived at the court of the Polish Duke, Bolesław, who welcomed him with open arms. Bolesław was well aware of the tragedy of the Slavnik clan, and the massacre was politically advantageous to him, as it eliminated potential allies of the Czech Przemyslids. But most importantly, in the disgraced bishop, the Polish Duke saw not just a holy man, but a unique political opportunity that could not be missed. This opportunity was linked to his long-held dream. Like his father, Bolesław aspired to create an independent church province in Poland, that is, an archbishopric. This was a key element of state sovereignty. However, such a step required a compelling reason and the approval of the Pope and the Emperor. And Bolesław realized that it was Adalbert, with his status and connections, who could give him that reason. Bolesław supported Adalbert's dream of missionary work among the pagans. The chosen target was the Prussians, a warlike Baltic tribe living northeast of the Duke's domains. The choice was not random. A successful mission would bring new lands under Polish influence. But, as Bolesław might have cynically calculated, failure could yield even greater rewards in the form of the martyrdom of a prominent church leader. In the spring of 997, Adalbert, accompanied by his half-brother Gaudenty and a small escort of Bolesław's warriors, set off by boat from Gdansk into the lands of the Prussians. The mission went wrong from the start. The Prussians met the strangers with extreme hostility, did not understand their language, and considered their sermons to be witchcraft. Soon, Bolesław's warriors, seeing the futility of the enterprise, abandoned the missionaries. On April 23, 997, during morning prayer in a grove sacred to the Prussians, Adalbert and his companions were attacked. The bishop was pierced by 7 spears, after which his head was cut off and impaled on a pole as a sign of victory. His companions were released so they could report what had happened. Thus, Adalbert met the martyr's death he had so fervently sought. When news of Adalbert's death reached Gniezno, Bolesław acted immediately. He sent envoys to the Prussians with an offer to buy the martyr's body. According to legend, the pagans demanded as much gold as the remains weighed. Bolesław, without hesitation, paid the required price. The saint's body was brought to Gniezno in triumph and interred in the main cathedral. Bolesław's calculation had paid off completely. News of the martyrdom of such a prominent church leader shocked Christian Europe. Pope Sylvester II immediately canonized him, and Adalbert became the first Slavic saint to be venerated throughout the Western Church. His friend, the pious young Emperor Otto III, was deeply shaken by the death of his mentor and decided to personally undertake a pilgrimage to his tomb. Bolesław had gotten exactly what he wanted. He had become the guardian of the relics of a pan-European saint. His capital, Gniezno, turned into an important center of pilgrimage. And most importantly, the Holy Roman Emperor himself was coming to visit him. The Polish Duke fully understood the historical significance of this visit and prepared for it with meticulous care. He intended to give the emperor a reception that would capture his imagination and demonstrate to the entire world that the Polish state was not a barbarian backwater, but a powerful and civilized nation worthy of royal status. The game, which began with a bet on the life of a disgraced bishop, was entering its decisive phase. An unprecedented procession was already moving along the roads of Poland. In March of the year 1000, a procession led by Emperor Otto III moved through the snow-covered roads into the very heart of Poland. As he neared his destination, he dismounted his horse and, as a sign of penance and humility, walked barefoot. His pilgrimage to the tomb of his friend, Saint Adalbert, was not just an act of personal piety, but also a carefully calculated political gesture, an element of his plan to reshape Europe. Bolesław understood the full importance of the moment and prepared to meet the emperor on an imperial scale. He rode out to meet Otto at the border on the Bobr River, and, upon seeing the barefoot emperor, according to a chronicler, could not hold back his tears. Along the entire route to Gniezno, ceremonial regiments of his warband stood at attention, and luxurious tents were pitched. He showed his guest his hospitality, military might, and immense wealth. The first Polish chronicler, Gallus Anonymous, left an enthusiastic description of this reception. When the emperor entered Gniezno, he was stunned by the magnificence of the capital, which was adorned with precious fabrics, gold, and silver. But what impressed him most was Bolesław's enormous warband, divided into units by the color of their attire. The number of nobles and knights seemed truly incredible to him. The culmination of the visit was the 3 days spent in Gniezno. The central event was, of course, a joint prayer at the tomb of St. Adalbert. But beyond the cathedral walls, high politics were unfolding. The two young rulers, 33-year-old Bolesław and 20-year-old Otto, bound by friendship and a shared reverence for the saint, discussed the future of all of Europe. And the emperor had a very ambitious plan for it. Otto, raised by his Greek mother, Empress Theophanu, and the most learned men of his time, was not a typical ruler. He dreamed of creating a universal Christian empire that would not be based on German domination, but on a federation of 4 equal sister kingdoms: Italy, Germany, Gaul, France, and Slovenia, the land of the Slavs. His plan was truly revolutionary. It was in Gniezno that this grand dream began to take concrete shape. During the so-called Congress of Gniezno, which had 2 crucial aspects, ecclesiastical and secular, a key role in the imperial plan was assigned to Poland and to Bolesław personally. The ecclesiastical outcome of the Congress was the fulfillment of the primary dream of the Polish ruler and his father. With the consent of the emperor and the papal legate accompanying Otto, an independent archbishopric was established in Gniezno. The first archbishop was St. Adalbert's half-brother, Gaudenty. Subordinated to this new archdiocese were 3 newly created bishoprics, in Kraków, Wrocław, and Kołobrzeg. Poland's ecclesiastical independence was finally achieved. The significance of this event was enormous. Poland gained full church independence from Germany, with its church now reporting directly to Rome. This meant that the Polish ruler could influence the appointment of bishops in his own country, a vital attribute of state sovereignty. But the secular aspect of the Congress proved even more dramatic. The secular outcome of the Congress was the famous act of coronation, when Otto placed his own imperial diadem on Bolesław's head. Historians still debate whether this was a full coronation or merely a symbolic act. The consensus is that it was the emperor's consent for Bolesław's future coronation and a recognition of his royal status, which only required papal anointment for formal confirmation. The rulers exchanged gifts filled with deep symbolism. Bolesław presented the emperor with the most valuable thing he possessed, the right arm of St. Adalbert, the very relic for which Otto had undertaken his pilgrimage. This gift was truly priceless and demonstrated the special bond between the 2 monarchs. In return, Otto gave Bolesław a replica of the Lance of St. Maurice. Since the imperial lance was one of the main symbols of power in the empire, presenting an exact copy of it signified the transfer of military authority and the recognition of Bolesław as the Holy Roman Empire's chief military ally on the eastern frontiers of Christendom. The German chronicler, Thietmar of Merseburg, who disliked the Poles and Otto's policies, wrote about these events with unconcealed irritation. He noted that the emperor, in an act that was hard to believe but true, had made his tributary, Bolesław, a lord, and elevated him to an unattainable degree. The German nobility was clearly displeased with this turn of events. After 3 days of feasts and negotiations, Otto left Gniezno, and Bolesław, with a magnificent entourage, escorted him all the way to Magdeburg. It seemed a golden age was dawning for Poland. It had become a recognized part of the Christian world, and Bolesław had transformed from a simple duke into a figure of pan-European stature, the brother and partner of the emperor, standing just 1 step away from a royal crown. But political summits can be deceptive. Bolesław did not yet know that the foundation of his triumph, his personal friendship with the dreamer emperor, was as beautiful as it was fragile. Fate was already preparing a crushing blow that would bring this house of cards crashing down and force the Polish duke to seek his path to the crown, not through friendship, but through blood and iron. The euphoria of the Congress of Gniezno was short-lived. Otto III's grand plans were too revolutionary for their time and met with quiet, and sometimes open, resistance from the conservative German nobility and clergy. They were accustomed to seeing the Slavs as objects of conquest and subjugation, not as equal brothers. To them, the emperor's policy was a betrayal of German interests. Fate granted the dreamer emperor too little time. Upon returning from Poland to Italy, he faced a revolt by the Roman aristocracy and was besieged in a castle. In January 1002, the 22-year-old Emperor Otto III, the last of the Saxon line, died of malaria. With his death, his great dream died too. For Bolesław, this news was a catastrophe. He had lost not just an ally, but a friend and patron who saw him as an equal and was prepared to grant him a royal crown. The entire political structure so painstakingly built in Gniezno collapsed overnight. Now, everything depended on who would become the new ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. The struggle for the vacant throne was fierce. The main claimant to the throne was a relative of the defunct dynasty, Henry, Duke of Bavaria. He was the complete opposite of Otto, not a dreamer, but a pragmatist to the core, a cold, calculating, and ruthless politician. For him, the interests of the German kingdom came first, not those of a universal Christian empire. Henry had no intention of continuing the policy of brotherhood with the Slavs, whom he saw as either tributaries or enemies. Understanding the threat that Henry's rise to power posed, Bolesław tried to intervene in the succession struggle by supporting another candidate, Margrave Eckhard of Meissen. However, his chosen candidate was soon assassinated. In June 1002, Henry of Bavaria was crowned in Mainz and became King Henry II of Germany. The friendship between Poland and the empire was over. Bolesław's enemy, a man of a completely different temperament, had come to power, and a clash was inevitable. The first conflict occurred at a congress of German nobles in Merseburg. Bolesław arrived there to swear allegiance for the lands he had received from Otto, but Henry received him coldly and humiliatingly, refusing to recognize his rights. On the way back, an attack was made on Bolesław and his retinue, from which the Polish duke barely escaped. He had no doubt that the new king was behind the assassination attempt. For Bolesław, this was an unprecedented insult and a de facto declaration of war. He realized that while Otto had been willing to give him the crown voluntarily, he would have to tear it from Henry by force. The peaceful path to his goal was closed, and the Polish duke, without hesitation, took up arms, launching a preemptive strike. The pretext for war was the situation in Bohemia, where a struggle for the throne had begun after the death of Duke Bolesław II. Bolesław the Brave, being a relative of the ruling Przemyslid dynasty, decided to exploit the chaos. He invaded the country and placed his own candidate, Władysław, on the Prague throne, who immediately acknowledged himself as Bolesław's vassal. When Władysław soon died from drinking, Bolesław took an even bolder step in 1003. He occupied Prague again, cunningly lured the Czech claimants to the throne to him, and dealt with them brutally, ordering one to be blinded and another castrated. After this, Bolesław the Brave proclaimed himself Duke of Bohemia, a direct seizure of power. Bohemia was traditionally considered a vassal of the Holy Roman Empire. By seizing it, Bolesław was creating a vast Slavic state stretching from the Baltic to the Danube, crudely interfering in the imperial sphere of influence. In response, Henry demanded that Bolesław swear a vassal's oath to him as the newly minted Duke of Bohemia. This the Polish ruler could not tolerate. Bolesław was prepared to acknowledge himself as a vassal for some borderlands, but not for Bohemia, and certainly not for all of Poland. His refusal meant war. In 1003, the first of 3 bloody wars between Poland and the Empire began. The era of friendship was gone forever, replaced by an age of iron and blood. The very model for the future of Central Europe was at stake. This was not a war of chivalrous duels, but a brutal and exhausting struggle of attrition. Both sides, shrinking from no method, sought to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, including making alliances with pagans, an unheard-of act for Christian rulers. This was a total war in which 2 great rulers clashed in a deadly struggle. The first phase of the war, from 1003 to 1005, ended in a heavy defeat for Bolesław. Henry II invaded Bohemia, where the local nobility, dissatisfied with Polish rule, defected to his side. Bolesław was forced to abandon Prague. Imperial troops then advanced deep into Polish lands, reaching Poznan. The Poles had to accept a humiliating peace and renounce all their conquests. It seemed the Polish duke's ambitions were broken, but he merely used the truce to rebuild his strength and prepare for revenge. As soon as Henry was distracted by internal problems, Bolesław resumed the war. The second phase, from 1007 to 1013, was much more successful for him. He reoccupied the disputed lands and launched devastating raids deep into Germany, reaching as far as Magdeburg. The war was waged with incredible cruelty. The chronicler Thietmar of Merseburg, a German bishop who hated Bolesław, describes the horrors perpetrated by both sides. Burned cities, populations driven into slavery, destroyed crops. He was particularly outraged that Henry II, a devout Christian, had enlisted the help of the pagan Luteci tribal federation, who eagerly participated in the raids, putting everything to fire and sword. The climax of the war was the heroic defense of the Silesian town of Niemca in 1017. Henry, by then crowned emperor, had assembled a huge army, including German knights, Czech allies, and 10,000 pagan Luteci. He laid siege to the small border fortress, confident of a quick victory, but its defenders offered desperate resistance. Thietmar, an eyewitness to the events, left a vivid description of the siege. The Germans brought up siege engines and dug tunnels, but the Poles not only repelled all assaults, but also made daring sorties. They dropped stones and logs on the enemy, poured boiling pitch, and when the Imperials brought up a siege tower, the defenders rolled out their own machine and smashed it to pieces. According to Thietmar, the Poles fought with unprecedented tenacity for their freedom, mocking the Germans and their pagan allies. They displayed a cross on the wall, showing that their cause was just and that the Christian God was helping them, unlike the emperor, who relied on idolaters. This was not only a military struggle, but also an ideological one. The siege dragged on. Famine and disease began to spread in the imperial camp, and morale plummeted. In the end, Henry II, having suffered a complete fiasco and heavy losses, was forced to lift the siege and retreat in disgrace. The heroic defense of Niemca became a symbol of Polish resistance and showed that even a small fortress could halt the full might of the empire. Between the second and third phases of the war, in 1013, a temporary truce was concluded in Merseburg. The terms were a compromise. Bolesław kept the disputed lands of Lusatia and Milsko, but acknowledged himself as the emperor's vassal for them. The peace was sealed by the marriage of Bolesław's son, Mieszko II, to Henry's niece, Richeza of Lotharingia. But everyone knew this was just a respite. This long 18-year conflict exhausted the resources of both countries and brought untold suffering to the population of the border regions. But at the same time, it had an unexpected result. In the brutal struggle with their powerful neighbor, the Poles, for the first time began to see themselves as a single people, united by a common ruler, a common faith, and a common destiny. The war had inadvertently created a nation. It was in this war that Bolesław earned his nickname, the Brave. He proved himself to be an outstanding military commander and a skilled diplomat, able to combine defense with offense, find allies, and exploit the enemy's divisions. He did not win the war outright, but he did not lose it either, successfully defending his country's independence against the full might of the Holy Roman Empire. While swords clashed on the western borders, events were unfolding in the east that would give Bolesław the Brave a chance to write his name into the history of another great state, Kievan, Rus. A new opportunity to expand his influence opened up, and as was often the case in that era, it was linked to a dynastic marriage. Around the year 1013, during a lull in the war with Henry, Bolesław married one of his daughters to Świętopolk, the Prince of Turów. This prince was one of the many sons of the Grand Prince of Kyiv, Vladimir Sviatoslavich. The marriage was a far-sighted political move, establishing an alliance with a potential heir to the Kievan throne. Along with the Polish princess, Bishop Reinburn arrived in Turów, intended to serve as Świętopolk's political advisor and as Bolesław's agent of influence. Grand Prince Vladimir regarded this alliance with great suspicion, seeing it as an attempt by his son to break away from Kyiv and spread Latin influence. After receiving a report of a conspiracy, he ordered the arrest of Świętopolk, his wife, and the bishop, and had all three thrown into prison. For Bolesław, the arrest of his daughter was a personal insult and a failure of his Eastern policy. He could not leave it unanswered. In 1015, when the war with Henry II resumed, Bolesław, having secured the support of the nomadic Pechenegs, raided the borderlands of Ruses to take revenge and divert Vladimir's forces. But soon, the situation changed dramatically. In the summer of 1015, Grand Prince Vladimir died. With his death, a brutal civil war began in Ruses. Świętopolk was released from prison and seized the Kievan throne. According to the primary chronicle, it was he who sent assassins to kill his younger brothers, Boris and Gleb, who would later become the first Russian saints. For this fratricide, Świętopolk earned his nickname, the Accursed. However, Świętopolk had another, much stronger rival, his brother Yaroslav, who ruled in Novgorod. Relying on the Novgorodians and a hired Varangian retinue, Yaroslav went to war against the fratricide. In a decisive battle near Lübeck, he utterly defeated Świętopolk's army. The vanquished prince fled by the only available route, west, to his father-in-law, Bolesław the Brave. This was Bolesław's finest hour. He now had a legitimate reason for a full-scale invasion of Rus, to restore his son-in-law to the throne. In 1018, immediately after concluding the favorable Peace of Bautzen with Henry II, he assembled a huge army consisting of Polish warriors, German knights, Hungarian mercenaries, and a contingent of Pechenegs, and marched east. Yaroslav and his army came out to meet him. The decisive battle took place on the western Bug River. The chronicler relates that Yaroslav did not have time to prepare for battle. While his warriors were setting up camp, Bolesław, taking advantage of their confusion, suddenly ordered his forces to cross the river. His armor-clad knights fell upon the unprepared Rus's army and completely routed it. Yaroslav himself, with only a few attendants, fled to Novgorod. He was so demoralized by the defeat that he wanted to flee further, across the sea, to the Varangians. Only the passionate pleas and support of the Novgorodians persuaded him to stay and begin gathering a new army to continue the fight. Meanwhile, the path to the capital of Rus was open. In August 1018, Bolesław the Brave triumphantly entered Kyiv, which had been left defenseless. The city surrendered to the victor. This event is associated with one of the most famous Polish legends, the legend of the Szczerbiec, the coronation sword of Polish kings, which supposedly got its name on that very day. According to this legend, as he entered the city, Bolesław struck the Golden Gate of Kyiv with his sword, leaving a notch, a szczerba, on the blade. However, historians have proven that the Szczerbiec sword itself, which is kept in Kraków, was forged 2 centuries later, and the famous Golden Gate was built under Yaroslav the Wise after the Poles had left. Nevertheless, the legend perfectly captures the symbolic significance of the campaign. After restoring Świętopolk to the Kievan throne, Bolesław was in no hurry to leave. He stationed his garrisons in Rus's cities and acted in Kyiv as the absolute master, sending triumphant messages to Emperors Henry II and Basil II, boasting of his great victory. He behaved like a true conqueror. However, Bolesław's position was not as secure as it seemed. According to the chronicler Tietmar, the Polish warriors behaved like invaders, provoking the growing hatred of the Kievans. Świętopolk himself, having achieved power, had no desire to remain a puppet in the hands of his father-in-law and began secretly preparing to rid himself of his liberators. Sensing that the atmosphere was becoming tense and fearing he might be treacherously murdered, Bolesław decided to leave. He departed Kyiv, taking with him an enormous treasury, many noble captives, including 2 of Yaroslav the Wise's sisters, and, most importantly, annexed the disputed border territory, known as the Chervon cities, to Poland. Although his triumph in Rus's was not lasting in the long term, as soon as he left, Yaroslav the Wise drove out Świętopolk and reclaimed both his power and his lands. For Bolesław himself, the Kyiv campaign of 1018 was the pinnacle of his military career. He had humiliated the Prince of Kyiv and expanded his domains. Now, for a complete triumph, he lacked only one thing: a crown. Parallel to the continuous wars, a difficult and unseen work of state-building was underway within the country. Military victories brought glory, but creating a durable state required strong central authority, an effective administration, and a functioning economy. And Bolesław, like his father, was not only a warrior, but also a builder, whose methods were as harsh as his methods of warfare. The foundation of his power was a huge professional war band. This was not just an army, but an entire social and political corporation of several thousand warriors, bound to the Duke by personal loyalty. He fed, clothed, and armed them, and in return, they allowed him not only to fight powerful neighbors, but also to keep his own nobility and subject tribes in check. To govern the vast territory, Bolesław created an extensive administrative system based on a network of fortified settlements, or grody. These centers were not only military fortresses, but also administrative and fiscal hubs. At the head of each district was a castellan appointed by the Duke, who collected taxes, administered justice, and commanded the local militia in his name. Bolesław understood that the church was not only an institution of faith, but also a powerful tool of governance. In that era, priests and monks were virtually the only literate people, capable of conducting correspondence, drafting laws, and serving as advisors and diplomats. He actively used them as part of his state apparatus, and monasteries became centers of learning and technology. By generously endowing bishops and building cathedrals, Bolesław received not only prayers in return, but also an ideological justification for his power. The church diligently taught its flock that the Duke was God's anointed, and any disobedience to him was a grave sin. Thus, the monarch's power acquired a sacred, divine character. However, the process of Christianization was far from smooth. Pagan beliefs were still very strong among the people, and many, especially in remote areas, continued to secretly worship the old gods. Bolesław eradicated paganism with iron cruelty, imposing the new faith with fire and sword to ensure the ideological unity of his realm. Even the hostile chronicler Tietmar describes with grudging respect Bolesław's draconian laws aimed at strengthening Christian morality. If someone ate meat during Lent, their teeth were simply knocked out. For adultery, the guilty party was tied to a bridge with a knife placed nearby, given the choice to either die of starvation or perform self-castration. An important step in strengthening sovereignty was the minting of his own coin. Bolesław became the first Polish ruler to organize the mass production of silver denarii, on which his name and title, Duke of Poland, were stamped. This not only strengthened the economy, but also served as a powerful propaganda tool. On some particularly rare coin specimens, the ruler's head is depicted in a helmet or even a crown, indicating his royal ambitions long before his formal coronation. Minting his own coin was not just an economic act, but a political one, spreading the name and image of the all-powerful ruler throughout the country and far beyond its borders. What kind of ruler was Bolesław to his subjects? To his warriors and high nobility, he was a great leader and hero. To the clergy, a generous patron and defender of the faith. But for the common people, his reign was most likely a heavy burden. The maintenance of a huge army, the construction of fortresses, and endless wars demanded their sweat and blood. Later, chroniclers created two opposing images. Gallus Anonymous, writing at the court of Bolesław's great-grandson, painted an idealized portrait of a father of the people, under whom Poland was a land of universal prosperity, where justice and order reigned. This image is undoubtedly more of a panegyric than an objective description. Thietmar of Merseburg, in contrast, portrays a cruel, power-hungry, and treacherous tyrant, an ungrateful vassal and an oppressor of his own people, who for the sake of his boundless ambitions plunged the Christian world into a long, bloody war. For him, Bolesław was an enemy and a destroyer. The Russian Primary Chronicle depicts him as a proud and lustful invader who came to the lands of Rus like a predator and was ultimately forced to flee, leaving behind only blood and ruin. In this tradition, he is a foreign aggressor who took advantage of turmoil for plunder and to satisfy his pride. Modern historical science, free from national myths, sees him as a more complex and tragic figure. Bolesław was, without a doubt, one of the most outstanding statesmen of his era, possessing strategic vision, an unbending will, and incredible energy. He completed his father's work, definitively bringing Poland into the circle of European powers. However, his continuous wars on two fronts exhausted the country to its limits, and his conquests proved fragile, being lost immediately after his death. He built a structure that was too large and heavy for the foundation he had managed to lay. His ambitions clearly exceeded the real capabilities of his young state. And yet it was he who established the idea and the myth of a great and independent Poland, which would inspire his descendants for 1,000 years. He was the first to wear the royal crown, and the memory of this would never allow the Poles to accept the status of a second-rate power. By challenging both the West and the East, he asserted his people's right to their own place in history. Bolesław I, the Brave, was a man who lived and died on the edge of a sword. Just as sharp, brilliant, and deadly was the legacy he left behind. We thank you for your attention to this chronicle from the so-called Dark Ages. The story of the first Polish king is just one of many in a series of great events. To avoid missing new stories about the people whose ambitions and will changed the map of Europe, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time.